fake data that we've set up to be a useful example. In some ways, I think it's actually a little bit harder because this isn't our operation, so we don't actually know all of the details behind what's been given to us. So we have that. And then the other thing is, I know Matthew just shared in the chat 2 links. So those I'm going to screen share in a minute. But those are the data sheet that has like all of the information we're going to be entering and the blank workbook. So I'll be screen sharing, but if you would like to work along with us or kind of scroll around the workbook and explore it on your own, you're welcome to download those and do that. So with that, I will jump into screen sharing. I did also just want to say we're going to be trying to go through this example, but are really not set on actually getting through it and are much more interested in kind of hearing questions that come up and conversations. So please feel free to jump in with a question at any time. I think here you can actually enter chats directly into the Zoom chat, and Matthew will be watching it for us. Matthew, do we also have them set that they can unmute themselves, or do you need to unmute them if they'd like to?
I need to unmute.
Okay, great. So you can enter a question in the chat or raise your hand, and then Matthew can unmute you. But we'd love to really just have, especially with this small group, have a discussion. Matthew, you might even be able to just change the settings so that people can unmute themselves. There's so few of us.
Ourselves, yeah, as participants.
Okay, great. I guess before I get started, are there any questions just coming out of the plenary? I feel like we kind of zoomed through that. No. Okay, well then I'll jump in. So what we're looking at here is the workbook, which is an Excel file for a specific component. So when Ruthie was showing that kind of map of all of the components of a sanitation system and the different options, we have a different workbook that's tailored to each of those. And the idea there is that we can ask more specific questions that hopefully kind of ring true to what someone will recognize as they're trying to enter their data, and make it a little bit easier that way. This component is within a fecal sludge management system, and it's for both combined emptying and transport and what we call wheels human powered. And then the wheels corresponds to the transport part. The human powered is interesting. That means either emptying or transport is human powered. In this case, most often it's going to be the emptying is human powered. So it's like a manual emptying operation combined with transport to treatment by truck. I think Ruthie did mention in the plenary that within these components, we can either have the combined emptying and transport or the separate emptying and separate transport. What's important there is that if it was a manual emptying operation that doesn't actually transport the waste to treatment, that gets categorized separately because those costs really aren't comparable to one that is transporting all the way to treatment. I think there's actually some great data shared about that yesterday in one of the sessions on pit emptying. So just quickly to kind of scroll through the workbook, we've got 5 tabs that are facing the users. The one is the context, where you're just going to enter information about your operation. So we've kind of pre-filled that here with some made up data. So what's your name of it? How do you describe it? Just giving us some contextual information about what it is. And then we have tabs for direct and indirect CapEx and direct and indirect OpEx, where you'll actually enter the cost for different cost items. So just jumping in, and Matthew and Tristano, I'm just going to note, I can't really keep track of the chats here. So if anyone is jumping in with questions, just interrupt me at any time. Or
yeah, there are
that's fine.
questions.
That's fine.
I was actually writing on that. But the first one is how to unmute. Matthew, can you actually change and allow people to speak?
I've changed it. It's been addressed.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And the second question is for how long we stay in the breakout rooms. It's
30 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're here for another 25 minutes, and then we'll go back to plenary at 11:30. The plan for plenary is to look at what do we do with this data when it's collected? So it should be interesting, and Barbara will be presenting there. Yeah. Okay, so kind of jumping in, the context tab, like I said, the top here has been pre-filled. The next section is this like service information. And gosh, the service information is really important because the key metrics that Cactus is calculating is the total annualized cost per person and total annualized cost per household. So that like how many people are you serving and how many households are you serving is the denominator there, and really important. Here we have like two options for entering it. One is these like primary service parameters, where if you can just tell us how many people you serve, that's great. And that's really easy. In fact, this is some of actually the hardest information to know. And so a lot of people can't tell us. And so we have these kind of additional questions that would basically, if you can give us any information that you do have, then we can try and deduce and figure out what the correct service population is. It also, even if you know the exact numbers, providing the information here then helps us do the calculation for other data points in the future. But for this specific example, we can look at the service coverage and operation information down here at the bottom. And what they're telling us is that they serve an average of 34 containments in a month, and that each containment serves one household. If I remember, I think this is actually supposed to say each, oh no, never mind, this is a different one. So yeah, 34 containments per month and one household. And so the number of households served is then equal to the 34 per month times 12 months. And then the other thing that's important here is this emptying frequency. So they say between 1 and 3 years. So that means if they empty a pit in 1 year, then it's an average of 2 years, so the middle of 1 and 3 before they come back. And we're actually going to use that to find the total population served. So multiply by 2. I expect that might not be totally intuitive to most people. When I first went through this example, I was like, wait, we're not multiplying by 2 here, because we want to find out how many people they serve in a year, because a lot of the costs we're collecting are based on year. But what we're actually trying to figure out is like, what is the annual operating cost for the total population that they can serve? And for that, you actually need to look at like, well, if they're only emptying every other year, then the population is how many they serve in 2 years. So that's what we have here. Number of people per household, they tell us there's an average of 6. And then the number of people served would just be equal to the number of households times the number of people in each household. Oh gosh. And then I'm just going to pause there if anyone has questions or comments. The other thing I would do is fill in some information. So.
Okay, so we have one question from Jonathan Wilcox. He's asking, does the updated tool include a process for establishing the uncertainty or giving a confidence interval in the calculated TAC, T-A-C-H?
Thanks, Dan, for joining while you could. And Jonathan, I think so. There's actually, I think that's actually a 2-part question, because we can do both. So I'll actually jump to the next tab, which is where we're going. This is one thing we've been working on: is how do you indicate uncertainty in a cost? And so it's a 2-part question, because I think there's one element which is like, how does the person giving us the data tell us that there's uncertainty, and how much there is? And then what do we do with that information? And so the part about how do they tell us if there's uncertainty, we've added in this box where they can kind of select a range. And I would say we're still playing with this, and that it feels very specific to be able to say, like, I know this within plus or minus 10%. And it's actually, like, most people probably don't know that exactly. But it does at least give some opportunity to tell us, like, how confident you are in it, or like how much variability there is in a specific cost. And the question on, like, how it would be calculated in the TAC, I think, Tristano, you might be able to jump in more, but my understanding is that we're still kind of deciding based on the data that comes in, like, how we would actually work that in. But Tristano, I think you could jump in better there.
Yeah, I mean, we can elaborate on this. As you can see, this uncertainty is allocated for the different detailed cost voices that we are considering, as well as for other important variables. So the idea is really to then process all this data, because the long-term outcome of this data collection exercise is to allow a reliable benchmarking exercise. So that is because sometimes we've got, let's say, a case study where people are relatively confident, for example, of many of these cost voices, but they don't have any clue about a specific one. Well, in those scenarios, for example, we will be able to replace eventually with a comparable case study, so that in a way we take the best use of the information we have, and so that it's possible to create a sort of parametric cost estimation model that will be useful to target a specific context. So that is in general terms what there is behind this Cactus tool, and how we process this information. Is really about the reliability and the trust that we place on this information. But because we didn't complete the last stages of this, for the moment we are collecting the data, and there is the potential to use this information also with other kind of representations, for example, showing the ranges for our estimations. If it makes any sense, that would be my feedback to this question.
Yeah, that makes sense, Tristano. Thank you very much for answering the question. I have kind of a follow-up question then. How much data do you think you need? Do you think you will need to collect to be able to do this parametric estimation, where you're using data from other case studies to plug the gaps in others, or to plug the uncertainty? Yeah. Because there are so many variables, so to do a good analysis, it's a big data.
And absolutely, it's not only that. There are also many different technologies, or using our terminology, different systems and different components. So our plan is to, from one side, to cover as much as possible all different combinations of elements and systems all across the value chain, but at the same time to provide reliable estimations, at least for some of them. And therefore, part of the data we collect already, and part of the effort will be really to show this feature. So your question was, how many do we need? At the moment, we've got around 100 data points in our database. And I think the maximum we've got for the different components is like 5 or 6. I'm not too sure about that. I should ask Fiona, and that it's not sufficient. At least we should double the size in order to follow up with the predictable parametric estimation on that specific component. So really the objective is, from one side, to collect the data, to the other one to improve this data collection tool and encourage people to collect the data and use it, and then to show the benefits of that, as Barbara will show, and finally to show its potential on some of the specific components. But it's going to be difficult to do this data collection in depth with many case studies for the different technologies and elements. We will do just for a few of them. And then when we collect and we allow third parties to collect the data for benchmarking purposes, we will try to use also that data in order to enrich our database, and therefore expand this analysis also on the other technologies where we don't have sufficient data. I hope it answered your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tristano. And is it okay if I keep asking questions, or do you, Lauren?
I don't know, Lauren. Yeah. Lauren, you decide, please.
No, I'm happy for questions. I was just going to add on a little bit to what you said, Tristano, and say
Yes,
like, I think the question on like how much data we need is like, yeah, we definitely need more data, and that's definitely a push, like exactly where we are right now in the process. You know, a lot of work has gone into figuring out like how do we establish these different components to like group different types of systems, or yeah, what we usually call systems into these components. What information do we actually need? How do we categorize it? Next up was like, how do we get like the tools that people can actually give us the data? And now we really need data to keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So could I follow up on my first question about uncertainty? So Lauren, you talked about how you can record uncertainty in the input variables. Does the tool communicate the uncertainty in the TAC estimate at the end? So for example, it might say that the full service chain estimate is like $80 per person per year. And then would it communicate like a range of uncertainty with that as well, based on the uncertainty in the estimating variables? So Tristano, you call it something else, the cost voices? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
is that to come in future versions?
No, of course. I mean, the short-term version of the tool is for selecting and entrusting the data. So if the reliability of some of these is very low, we keep it, but we have the option eventually to drop it and replace the specific components because it's too uncertain.
Yeah.
We keep record of these uncertainties, and we've got in some of our reporting system that we are testing already shown how to report these ranges. We are not too sure that, because we don't want to proliferate too many graphs and too many analysis, because I think what is the essence of this benchmarking tool is also to be able to communicate a sort of stable and recognizable and a meaningful set of graphs rather than proliferating too many and too many complicated. So that is the other side of the spectrum in this trade-off. We have the capability, and we will be able to actually consider those ranges directly, for example, in expanding the ranges of our cost estimation. We are not too sure that will be the actual and recognizable output that they want to portray outside. But we are very happy to learn your view and the view of anyone else who is interested, if you feel that is an interesting bit to consider or not. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. And then I guess the next thing is, I asked about uncertainty, but then also with each of the service types, there's also I don't know quite what the right phrase is, but like natural variation in the expected cost of that service type. So I don't know, sewers have, for example, sewers, which people tend to know more about, have some variability in the cost of that, or sewer-based systems have quite a lot of variability that you would expect when making like a first estimate for implementing a service. And does the tool communicate that as well?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
The real problem is in the end, because of the variability. I mean, at the beginning, we explore alternative avenues when we tackle this issue of uncertainty. One of the need we had was really to simplify also for the users, because already the spreadsheet and the workbook is sufficiently complicated. So and we want to minimize also the input for the people, and that was an important need to consider as well. When we consider originally, we consider, for example, another issue that you didn't mention, the fact that it could be asymmetrical, that range, and we decided to keep asymmetrical because that was a simplification of something that is already complicated. Having said that, the other issue is when you report all the ranges, it would be very easy, for example, to consider all the minimum on the minimum cost, for example, and adapt them, and adapt the maximum one, and consider the figure that was established. The issue with that is that in practice, we've got the ranges that are too big. And the risk is that we portray outside something that is perceived not to be too meaningful, because when the ranges is from it costs from £1 to 100 million pounds. It starts to be completely meaningful. So to an extent, we would like to force also this data collection tool and the people really to try to converge toward a reliable estimation rather than allowing people to diverge toward a huge range estimates. Can you?
Yeah,
So that would be my answer.
great.
I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, that was really good. Yeah. I have thought of another question, but I'll save it for a few more minutes.
Okay.
Great. And we have about 9 minutes left. So I'd say like maybe let's try to enter cost in one tab and then we can pause again. And I'd be happy if we end up just doing discussion for the rest of it. But yeah, to at least enter in one. So this is our CapEx tab. And if we're looking for CapEx for this manual emptying and truck transport operation, here's all of them. I've looked through it so I can identify them a little faster. I can tell you we have here a truck and a push cart that they're using. One thing that's interesting is they also have emptying tools, which could technically be listed as CapEx, but we see that they're replacing them every 6 months or every 3 months. So there's also the option to place those in the OpEx tab, and that's where we'll do that. So these two will be left blank. The carts and wheelbarrows we have, and we can see a push cart is 1,500 kwacha, but there are 2 of them. So I'm going to put both of them here for 2. The currency has been automatically filled in from the context tab. We put it in at the beginning. For this confidence, I'm going to say plus or minus 0% because presumably this is some kind of financial record and this is exactly what we paid for it. The lifetime they've given us as 3. And the year purchased was 2016. This is kind of an interesting column. It says indicate if the cost is incurred, but it is not reported. And you can kind of select an X there. This was because of a concern about like missing costs that we sometimes have. Not super likely to come up in this case of like a hand cart. But I think more often it might be the case of like, you can build a treatment plant and for some reason like you were given the land for free and you don't actually know what the cost of that land is because you never paid it. And so it's something that you should be paying and like it should be built into the cost of this operation, but you don't have it. I would say that's something we're also still kind of figuring out like what to do with that information and how to use it, but it is important to understand that and to collect it. And then the notes, again, the notes are just really helpful for us at the end to understand what's there. So you might just say there, accounts for 2 parts. I think everything else is kind of captured already in the others. The other one we have is the transport vehicle. So we have the truck for transporting waste, which is 11,649. And apparently it was purchased in pounds. So we can just overwrite this into pounds. Again, they know the exact cost. The lifetime for this time is 10 years. And it was also purchased in 2016. And just say 1 truck. One thing that I do want to point out is Ruthie shared a quick like screen grab, but one thing we're not showing you is the manuals, which maybe I'm a bit biased because I did a lot of work on them, but I would say are potentially like more useful than this workbook, and that they would explain to you exactly like what is meant to go in all of these, what each of the columns are, and it even has questions for like, or sections for like frequently asked questions to try and explain things that are confusing. So actually, if you're going through this, what I would recommend is having a workbook open and the manual right next to it, because it'll really walk you through line by line what might go in each of them.
5 minutes.
Great. So that's actually it for this page. There's major and extraordinary repairs. If you've had a chance to kind of glance through the data sheet, there's nothing reported here. which is fine. There is like maintenance reported in the truck and push cart, which we would put on the OpEx tab. It's, you know, it's possible that some of those really are major and extraordinary repairs, but if they're counting it as OpEx, that's fine. We can also do that. There's also an option where if you like were paying financing charges on those trucks, you could enter them here. But I think that's kind of another takeaway is just, you know, when you open these workbooks, you're like, wow, there's so many things to enter. But in actuality, like what we're trying to do is like pull out the key things that we expect might show up for each type of component, so that it kind of acts like a checklist so that someone could go through and be like, okay, no, I'm not putting manual emptying tools here because I'm putting them in OpEx, you know, or I don't have motorized emptying pumps, so I'm not entering that. And it lets you do that checklist so you wouldn't like forget anything, particularly if it is one of those missing costs that we're not expecting that everyone would have everything here. I think with 4 minutes left, I'd rather just pause and see if there are more questions, comments, anything anyone would like to share, or if you want me to, if there's a specific section you want to jump to, just let me know.
Lauren, I had one question if nobody else does, and it's about the boundaries for the TAC. And I remember reading in the methodology paper that it was like, I can't remember exactly, but limited to the physical infrastructure that's installed and doesn't capture the program management of delivering the infrastructure or beyond. So has that changed much, or is it still the same, the boundaries of the costs that you're covering and that you're not covering?
Can I take a first stab at that, Tristano, and then you can
Of course.
jump in. So I think what you're asking about is kind of like these indirect costs. And as far as like program management, so I would say like we do ask for indirect costs that might be, you know, like office staff, if you have like an administrative office. I think this one doesn't have it, but you know, like if you had like an office with a call center and someone that was like fielding customer calls, like that kind of administrative support you would want to include. But if it's like high overhead of like, you know, like it's a USAID project and there's lots of like admin staff who are administrating this project to get it set up, we're excluding that kind of overhead and administrative cost. I'm going to turn to both Jonathan and Tristano to see if that answered the question, and Tristano, if I missed anything that's important there.
Oh, I will be happy, but if you want, Jonathan, I can continue the answer. It depends on you whether you are satisfied or not.
Yeah, I guess it sounds like it hasn't changed since the definition that you included in the paper last year or the year before.
No, I don't think so, but as Laurent said, it's a full costing approach, so it should include the indirect cost as well.
Yeah, okay, brilliant, thank you.
Nice. Yeah, anyone else? I said it should include just because we realized when we started the data collection that sometimes people really don't have any clue on some of the indirect costs. So really collecting the data is helping us to an extent to readjust also these boundaries that you were mentioning. Because in theory, it's relatively easy to say, well, full costing, we want to include all the overheads and indirect costs. But in reality, if on all the cases we collected, they don't provide you information, that is a problem. And therefore, to keep comparable the cases, we rather decide to eventually drop some of the indirect cost voices and to have a reliable estimation and a comparable benchmarking.
30 seconds.
Yeah, so that would be just an additional elaboration on this. I'm done.
Great.
Thanks for answering all my questions. That's really great.
Thanks for bringing the questions. My biggest fear in a breakout room is a blank void, so this is much better. Thanks.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we can go back to the main session. So similar to before, you'll have to close out of this breakout room and then go back to the main session. And there we'll be looking at, well, assuming we had filled out this entire workbook, we're going to look at like what kind of analysis you can do coming out of it. And also actually two of the other breakout rooms, we're looking at a mechanical emptying and transport operation. So kind of what kind of comparisons we can do. So we'll see you there.
To that.